Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. It's always an honor to share with you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh boy, there's another political storm brewing, and the question is whether it's going to become a hurricane or it's just going to be a lot of rain. I like my metaphor. Anyway, it has to do with the intentions of President Manuel Lopez Obrador of passing a electoral reform, which could put in jeopardy the National Electoral Institute. To talk about this, or where we are with this potential reform, is Carlos Ramirez. He's from Integralia. He's been joining us for quite a while now. Carlos, welcome to the show. Can you just give us a breakdown as to where is the debate as we speak? Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Happy to be with you again. So very short context. Mexico has lived through 7 or 8 electoral reforms in the past 40 years. And basically, what Mexico has done in the past decades is grant the National Electoral Institute of complete autonomy to be able to organize and certainly count the votes of Mexicans. For many years, the vote counting was a very controversial issue in Mexico in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s. And it was until 1996 where the National Electoral Institute became completely autonomous. Okay, so now let's go to 2022. What is President Lopez Obrador proposing? Basically, he is proposing in the 4th year of his administration, highly unusual because most electoral reforms that were proposed in the past were done at the very beginning of the administration. Second, it was never presented by the executive. The president in the past electoral reforms was not the presenter of a reform, was the opposition parties. So now President Lopez Obrador comes out with a proposal that basically tries to do 3 things. 1, change completely, entirely, the functioning of the National Electoral Institute, basically the way that the board of the institute is selected, basically changing the way the operation of the institute, and in some way or another is a way to change fundamentally the way we've been counting votes for the past since 1996 in Mexico. Second, it diminishes or reduces the number of proportional representation deputies. In Mexico, there's 500 deputies. 200 of them come from the proportional representation formula. He basically wants to scrap that, eliminate completely the 200 deputies from this formula. And other thing, he wants to centralize the process of the electoral organization that currently is decentralized. So basically, in a nutshell, there's a lot of other things. That is what President Lopez Obrador is proposing, a highly controversial initiative. It needs a constitutional majority, 2/3 of Congress, of both chambers.
What does he gain by doing this? Why is he doing this? I mean, you watch any government when they make these types of proposals, you assume that they're trying to gain some type of advantage. I mean, just think about in the United States, the gerrymandering, for example, legislation. I mean, it's done not because they want to improve the elections in the United States. It's done because there's a party that wants to be able to have better control and increase its possibility of winning in the electoral during the election, the electoral process. So what's the advantages of this proposal for Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his party?
Yeah, excellent example. The gerrymander example is clearly, in some way or another, what President Lopez Obrador is trying to do. The Electoral Institute has always been in the eye of Lopez Obrador since the 2006 presidential election, where the candidate Lopez Obrador lost the election by a very small margin, and he basically argued that there was a fraud behind that result.
Mm.
Since then, he has been trying in some way or another to overcome the electoral rules. Now, that was in the past when he was opposition. Now that he is president, he wants to overturn the National Electoral Institute because he wants to have control of the elections. That's as simple as that. And he wants to have an advantage in the way how elections are organized. And he wants to have an advantage also on this debate about the proportional representation deputies. Because if the deputies disappear, the ones, the 200 that are currently elected by this formula, the winner will be the majoritarian party, which is currently Morena. So clearly it's a way to have advantage on future elections and probably remain in power for many decades in the future.
Let me ask you this. Now, the opposition or the parties of the opposition also have proposals. I was listening to some ideas that have been laid out, including what they call la segunda vuelta, which would be a mechanism by which if during the elections, presidential elections in particular, none of the candidates gains more than 50%, then there would have to be a runoff. I mean, how viable are those proposals, or what are they proposing?
Yeah. So currently the discussion is like a deaf discussion in the sense that there's no connecting dots between the proposal of the government and the proposal of the opposition parties. For example, the one that you mentioned, the second round of elections. Almost all countries in Latin America, with the exception of Costa Rica, and I think there's another country there, have a second round. It is a way of bringing more legitimacy to whoever is selected. Actually, Brazil will have a second round on Sunday. However, that proposal in particular is absolutely a no way for Morena, because it would mean that in some way or another, everything would converge to only two candidates at the end of the day, which will provide an incentive for voters to select either Morena or other parties. So clearly that's not going to happen. Morena will not approve that. So again, no one is talking to each other. And the reason why no one is talking to each other is because the executive, the president, presented a very aggressive and highly controversial proposal. So which the opposition clearly understand that if that passes, it would mean Morena for the next 2 or 3 decades in power.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, what are the expectations of the president? I mean, does he think they can corral or pressure legislators from the opposition so that they will have 3/4 of the vote, the way they did with the extension of the armed forces in public security matters, which apparently is what they did. I mean, they were able to get a constitutional reform that way. Or are they, I mean, what are the expectations?
Plan A is what you mentioned. Probably just recently, a constitutional reform was approved to extend the mandate of military in the streets, and the PRI voted together with Morena. So basically, they are thinking, or they are hoping, that they can convince and pressure the PRI to vote with them on this one too. But that's unlikely, because the PRI understands that this reform would clearly be negative for them in the next election. So I think that basically has little probabilities. Now, what is Plan B? Probably the president is thinking that when this constitutional reform is rejected by the opposition, he will obviously talk to the people, talk to the citizens, and say, the opposition doesn't want a reform, so I will have to propose a secondary law reform in which I will basically change some of the operation of the National Electoral Institute, even though it could mean that he will propose an unconstitutional reform, which
sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, it would mean obviously a lot of problems from a legal standpoint, but I think the president is probably thinking about Plan B as a way to complicate life for the National Electoral Institute. Remember, the National Electoral Institute will be in charge of doing the elections of 2024, the presidential election of 2024, And if you complicate the operations of the institute, that will mean that the election will probably have some problems in
Right.
coming in the next years, right?
Wow. Carlos Ramirez, it's always great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico.
Thank you, Ana Maria, for having it.
Thank you. Let's go to a break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. I'll be right back.